Hi, folks. I'm Oliver Libby, the host of The Owl Factor. Great to see you all back here again for our next episode. A little bit of background. I'm the co-founder of VC firm HL Ventures and the global nonprofit, The Resolution Project. And here on The Owl Factor, we feature meaningful conversations about the nexus between leadership and trust. The mix of these two are critically important for the world, and conversations around that really inspire me. Each episode features a different leadership precept, and we're focused today on the precept that diversity in every respect is crucial, but we're going to have a broad-ranging conversation with a really extraordinary guest. So with that, let me welcome the amazing Cheryl Dorsey. Cheryl is a trailblazer in the social entrepreneurship movement and the president of Echoing Green, a global nonprofit that, by the way, I've looked up to for a very long time and taken huge inspiration and cues from. Echoing Green supports emerging social entrepreneurs and invests deeply in their ideas and leadership. Prior to leading this social impact organization, Cheryl was a social entrepreneur herself and received an Echoing Green Fellowship in '92 to help launch the Family Van, a community-based mobile health unit in Boston. She became actually the first Echoing Green Fellow to head the Social Venture Fund in 2002 herself. She's an incredibly accomplished leader and entrepreneur. She served in 2 presidential administrations, so she's a cross-sector person as well. You all know how much I love that. She serves on boards including Bridgespan Group, Skoll Foundation, Oak Street Health, Northeast Bank, and actually the Harvard Board of Overseers as well. And to boot, she has a medical degree from Harvard Medical School, a master's in public policy from the Kennedy School at Harvard, and a bachelor's degree as well from Harvard Radcliffe, magna cum laude, to say the least. So an amazing person. We're so glad to have her here today. Cheryl, thank you very much for spending some of your time with us. And let me first just start by asking, how are you today?
Well, I'm great because I'm with you, Oliver. I'm so happy to see you, albeit virtually. It would have been great to be together in person, but given the circumstances, we'll take what we can get. But I am thrilled to be with you. We've been fellow travelers in the social impact space, so I'm really very appreciative that you reached out, and I'm happy to be in conversation with you.
Absolutely. Well, again, so grateful for your time. I know the many demands there are on it, and actually, that's kind of where I wanted to start, Cheryl. Knowing as I do about your role and your leadership at Echoing Green and beyond, there are so many communities that need to be sewn together to make an organization like Echoing Green work for its fellows and for the world and the important work you do. And when we think about the precepts that underlie the owl factor in our conversations here, leadership and trust and the nexus between the two, the first question I have for you would be around the key elements of trust that you use. What are some of the key precepts that you use to build trust in the communities that are around Echoing Green, whether it be the fellows, the funders, the team members? What are some of the key things that you've used to sow trust in the community and be able to lead effectively?
Well, that's a big question, but an important one. So I would say, certainly foundational for Echoing Green, which is all about talent spotting, going out into the world, identifying next generation voices, and then providing them with support to help make their communities and the world a better place. And I think what has always made Echoing Green special, a couple of things. Number one, what does it mean to really see someone? I mean, truly see them. So the concept of visibility is, I think, foundational when it comes to trust, right? So the fact that we see you in a particular way, which then leads you to sort of the second part of trust, which in some ways is implicitly a conversation about power, who has it, what's the balance between the two parties, and what does it mean to cede power to your fellows because you believe deeply that they understand their communities better than you ever could, that to stand alongside them is a privilege in and of itself. So there's something about power, there's something about truly seeing someone, which allows you, I think, in some ways, to cut through all of the interpersonal and systemic biases that prevent most of us from seeing our fellow man and woman or person. And then I think last but not least, there's the concept of risk, which becomes weaponized all the time and places a wedge between folks and prevents trust from being accrued and built. And what happens if you de-weaponize it and you actually flip it on its head, and you see abundance and opportunity where most folks see risk. All of that together sort of adds up and leads you to a place and space of trust, which then opens up a whole bunch of possibilities.
I think that's unbelievably insane. I love, by the way, the flipping of risk, which is a place where I spend a lot of my time in the VC world too. I'm curious about one thing too. Given the fact that you started as an Echoing Green Fellow and now have come obviously to be leading this storied organization, has it been helpful to you in establishing the kind of trust that we're talking about that you were once? And obviously, I think it's a fellowship for life, right? But that you started as an Echoing Green Fellow yourself.
I think it's critical, right? So I think the idea that Echoing Green has tried to be this safe, loving space for, by enough fellows, right? That's, can you create that blessed community that really does center its social entrepreneurs, its fellows? There's some, again, accrued level of trust and benefit of the doubt that you get by being a fellow traveler. So for sure, that like-minded fellow travelers allows you to sort of create the stickiness of relationships that are not only sticky but durable and transferable. And I think all of those reasons sort of come together to create this nice alchemy that allows this to be a space of trust. It doesn't mean it's not fraught. It doesn't mean it's not complicated, but you've got sort of the predicate of trust that allows you to walk through the headwinds because you've got that trust.
Absolutely. One of the things that I have admired from the beginning as I got to know you and Echoing Green, of course, is just how incredibly diverse. I mean, it's really a hallmark of the fellowship that it's extraordinarily diverse. And I think we can agree that perhaps Echoing Green was early to this conversation in really investing in a diverse fellowship. I wanted to ask you, as an organization that was so early to this conversation and has had such success fostering a diverse community, how was diversity embedded in Echoing Green's philosophy and operations from day one? Or was it?
It's a great question. So I think it was both um, uh, intentional and tangential, right? So let me walk through a couple of factors because it's such an important question, Oliver. So, given the work you do as a private equity professional, that Echoing Green was founded by the senior leadership of General Atlantic in 1987. One of the founders of Echoing Green, Ed Cohen, was not only a really savvy business person, but he was also an artist. And really liked the work, the artistry, and poetry of William Blake.
Hmm.
And Echoing Green is actually named after William Blake poem. And, I've learned about this over the last 20 plus years. William Blake was not only a painter and a poet, but a printer, a real iconoclast. And, one of my favorite quotes, which actually doesn't come from the poem on the Echoing Green, but which I think gets to sort of the heart and soul of what Echoing Green is and how we show up in the world, is the following quote. And, I should know it by heart, but I think I do. He basically said, I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's. I will not reason and compare. My business is to create. So that is both about sort of the entrepreneurial impulse, but it's also about justice and structural inequity, said in his 18th century way, right? 18th, 19th century way. So I think, in our DNA was this notion of speaking truth to power, pushing against unjust systems. And Echoing Green, from its earlier days, was doing the work of social innovation at the intersection of social justice. That's why, for example, Professor Robert Coles, also the civil rights fighter, was on my interview panel when I applied to Echoing Green. It's why when you look at the Echoing Green alumni community, you've got people like Van Jones, who got his start doing police accountability work in the early 90s, starting the country's first hotline in Oakland, to report police abuse, the Bay Area Police Watch. So we were born of these justice roots and nerves that has served us well. And then I think it partly goes back to my point about being an early stage, an angel investor in social innovators. It is so early stage, you have neutralized the concept of risk that comes with later stage investment, right? So when you're doing early stage, where in fact you're celebrating risk, you're leaning into risk, it actually allows you to invite in a bunch of unlikely folks who, when you get further into the social impact sector, into these investment chains, that leaves a whole bunch of folks out.
Totally. I'm glad you circled back there because there's a concept within one of the many mythologies of venture capital. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's the idea of pattern recognition. I'm going to invest in the thing that made me money last time. And I have long been a critic of this. I think it's a very toxic way of investing or building any kind of community. But one thing about it is that homogeneity is easy, right? If everyone looks the same, comes from the same background, is doing roughly the same thing, it's an easier community to manage in a sense. And one of the things that we've been dedicated to, both at the Resolution Project and at HL, is a much more diverse community, that harkens to, Echoing Greens. The question here is, when working with diverse communities, and especially when you have underrepresented founders and entrepreneurs, many of the communities from whence they come have had trust broken so many times. And so, pattern recognition and homogeneity is easy. Diverse communities and underrepresented founders, it is harder to build community and to build those trust links. Are there special things that you recommend or that you have lived through to create and bridge those gaps, those places where trust has been broken with underrepresented entrepreneurs and leaders?
Sure, that's an important question. So, number one, it's happened to us. We have broken trust where our fellow community didn't believe we showed up in the right way. But the beauty of it is, they called us on it, but they also said, we're going to help you fix it, right? So in part, it's because we had a level of trust. When you mess up, it's also your nearest and dearest who are going to dust you off and pick you back up and help you keep making the road by walking. And maybe this is because, I'm a woman of color who am very comfortable inhabiting the skin in which I live. I'm a Black woman of a certain age, having grown up in a very complicated, problematic society that was formulated on white supremacy. So it's like the air I breathe. There's no daylight between me and that experience. So it is not, for me, as personal, because I can see that it is partly structural, right? So we all inhabit a broader ecosystem of which we're a part, that is complicated. So I do think part of it is, it's difficult because it's difficult, but it is not necessarily always personal that it is difficult. So what happens is, instead of shutting down, you would do well to lean in. And you remember that book, Ben Horowitz's book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things. It's hard, but that doesn't mean you shy away from it. It means that if you can hang in there and put on your big adult pants, then you'll learn something and you'll get better along the way. So I think there's something about, don't shut down, lean in. I think it's also about having a structural conversation about how do you need to set things up, so you create a new and different way of coming together. And maybe part of it is, I didn't come to this work like a lot of folks from the world of business. I came from the world of healthcare. So I was trained up as a pediatrician, believe deeply in the framework of social determinants of health. You got to take a holistic approach to the work that you do. And when you're investing in entrepreneurs, it was very easy for me to get into a frame like, okay, there are a holistic set of supports we have to provide. The money's not enough. The technical support is not enough. So, for example, one of the things that Echoing Green offers is a whole body of supports related to healing and well-being, right? Sort of recognizing sort of the physiological, psychological, real world impacts of trauma and social exclusion on marginalized communities. So you gotta offer up something to counterbalance that. And I think that helps smooth the rough edges as well, because when you're not only trying to do the work, but doing it through the lens of trauma and pain and community disinvestment and lack of investment, it's not just about the organization, it's about much more than that. So I think those combination of factors sort of allows you to sort of create an organization and space that is thoughtful. But at the end of the day, it's not enough, as Dr. Kennedy says, not enough to not be a racist. You got to be an anti-racist. Like you got to show up for the work. You just have to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wrote a piece in Venture Capital Journal about the fact that there's a movement, of course, middle of last year that we all saw, and a lot of allocators were looking to start to launch a lot of people of color and women into being asset managers, and that's fantastic. But the point of my piece was, yes, and also it doesn't let the rest of us off the hook, right? Like we can't just say like, oh, good, like there's a bunch of people who look like the folks that need more money, so we should do that. And that's the solution. It actually takes the full body effort of the entire community that's funding innovation to aspire to a more diverse portfolio, and frankly there's so much value there anyway, right? But it's none of this lets you off the hook, right? To your point, it's
Yep.
Got to do the work.
Yep.
But so and actually this is one other thing that pops into my mind. It's not on my actual train of thought, but it's such a wise thing that you said is when you look at some of the communities around the country that have developed deep skepticism because of the history and the broken bonds of trust, it just strikes me that in the whole conversation we're having about vaccination, this isn't something that stays sequestered in those communities, right? Like there are times where we all need each other no matter what. And we're very sorry as a society when we've left folks behind or broken the bonds of trust, because then when we all need to believe something together and go do it, much harder to get everyone on board.
Here, here. Well said.
Well, derives right from what you were saying. So, as I think about another aspect of what I love about your work and Echoing Green, it's not just the gender and racial diversity of the fellowship. It's also the fact that in my experience of the Echoing Green Fellowship, it's obviously geographically diverse, it's topically diverse, it's diverse by age as well in some really important ways. And I wanted to ask you, as folks are thinking about investing in leadership, developing communities like this, what are some of the operational and tactical, tools of the trade whereby you have been able to build such multi-dimensional diversity into the organization?
I think part of the reason that I remain so attached to Echoing Green, and not only a proud fellow and alum of the community, but now staff for many years, I would say in part, Oliver, it was a way to live out what I studied in college. I was a history of science concentrator in college. I don't know what your concentration was, but I loved being a history and science concentrator, and spent a lot of time studying the work of Thomas Kuhn, right? Sort of the structure of scientific revolutions, which is so foundational in the way that I see the world, right? Like, why is the status quo so sclerotic, so powerful, so afraid of transformational change, and so unyielding? And Echoing Green in many ways is the antidote to that, right? And sort of Kuhn's philosophy is that change doesn't actually happen incrementally. We've got all these norms and processes and way of working in the world together because you need to reduce the friction. But then you get someone who comes along who so disrupts it and makes it impossible to keep doing the work the way you're doing, that leads to these leapfrogging advances in particular fields. And in many ways, that's what Echoing Green does. It goes out to find these lonely, intrepid voices who are speaking truth to power, and that's the tie that binds for Echoing Green, who see what the world could be, not what it is. And there's this shared loneliness and marginalization that brings all of us together. And there's something remarkably powerful about it. So again, I think there are values and an ethos that these folks know what they're talking about because of their lived experience. So we just need to shut up and listen, right? So there are ways to build processes around that. There are also ways to ensure that gets protected. So, for example, we've got a peer-led selection process. So someone who is of and by and for a community is much more likely again, it is a form of pattern recognition, Oliver. So um, hopefully it is not becoming turned in on itself, but remains expansive and thoughtful and inclusive. But it is a way to sort of hold community values because you're a part of it and you understand the ethos. And then I think it's to always be learning, right? And pushing yourself, which is why Echoing Green continues to innovate itself, which is why, 10 years ago, we started a secular chaplaincy program, helmed by one of our alums who came to us with that idea. That's why we started an impact investing program about a decade ago when most of our colleagues were saying, what in the world are you doing? So there's something about living the innovation story, because it keeps you humble, keeps you on your toes, but also allows you to create sort of an inclusive, open learning organization that becomes your framework for showing up.
Yeah, totally. By the way, when I mean everyone uses pattern recognition to some extent, but when you have a diverse group of people looking for their own patterns, then altogether you have something much, much less homogenous, which is still
Yeah.
really powerful. But the other thing, I mean, it was a big surprise to me. I think you and I even talked about this at one point, when we polled resolution fellows the first time and said, what is the biggest value of this program? The number one thing was mitigating loneliness. And it's funny when you think about leadership as like the busiest and most surrounded by people a lonely person will ever be.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
but it's quiet there on top when the decisions have to be made, and loneliness is a hugely pervasive part of this experience, I think.
Yep. For sure. For sure.
No doubt, no doubt. Um, you know, One of the things that's kind of a hallmark of today, right, is that, I mean, I think, I've always been philosophically entertained by the idea of like, has it always been this bad, or are we particularly fraught about like the period of time we live in? But actually, if we were 80 years ago, we'd have been having the same problems. But I think there are some things that are different about today, and one of them is the way that the kind of the vascular system of information has changed, and what that does to people and pushing them in various ideological directions, and what it frankly does to the ability for leaders to lead and to build trust. And so in your work, at Echoing Green, but also beyond as a leader, have you noticed the kind of the fraying of leadership capacity and trust as a result of these new information flows and polarization? Has that reared its head in the organizations you're with, and what are some of the things that you've done to kind of react to the new information environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's been sort of sort of at the 30,000-foot level. I am fond of observing, and it's just my observation, that I see social innovation and populism as two sides of the same coin, right? We are living in an increasingly complex world, the rapidity of change, the existential nature of problems, all of that make the stakes really high. And the populists see this and say, we've got to blow it all up. Nothing's working. Consequences be damned. It's a nihilistic approach, but it is a response to these factors. Social innovators also say, oh, this isn't working, but they don't want to blow it up. They want to fix it, right? So again, same diagnosis, but they're coming at it at two very different angles. But the factors that are leading these two camps to that diagnosis are these global forces: globalization, increasing income inequality, climate change that is disrupting patterns of migration, um, an increasingly multicultural world that scares a lot of folks, automation, information flows, as you said, Oliver. All of this is a lot, and it's too much to bear for a lot of the world. So it feels overwhelming to me, but I'm a big fan of the scholar Anne Applebaum, who sort of studies populism and authoritarian leaders. And I have to say, I'm persuaded by something that she often talks about when you've got these seemingly intractable political divisions. Sometimes she says, you just have to start taking on small problems together. Leave the politics out of it. Just fix something together. And then that goes back to trust. How do you build trust? You do small, quick wins that you can do together that demonstrates that you can solve something together. I'm compelled by that. It's not big and sexy and complicated, but just start making the road by walking. So as I try to think about, how do we get out of this? it kind of comes full circle to your point about trust building activities, which could be in a community saying, I'm not getting the vaccine, but I'm getting the vaccine, but we got a bridge that's broken. Let's figure out how we can fix it together. There's something about that exercise whose outcome will be a new bridge, but also could be some trust built that you can bank for future use.
Absolutely, absolutely. I love that. The idea of starting by doing small things. I mean, whenever you've seen, like, people put in a crisis situation that are very different, and then it's just like, well, let's build a raft together and get going in that direction. Like, yeah, totally get it. That's an amazing concept. So, well, Cheryl, first of all, I want to thank you again. I want to wrap up with one tradition that I'm trying to build at the Owl Factor, and another one that actually just popped into my head that I want to do for the first time with you, if you'll allow. The first tradition is I wanted to ask you, for 2 or 3 precepts in leadership that you want to share with our audience as they think about these things and learn from your wisdom. And then the last one I'll save as a surprise, but it's an easy question.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So, in no particular order, I guess this is because of the work that I do. I've got a paperweight here on my desk. It's a quote from Robert Schuller. It says, "What would you attempt to do if you knew you could not fail?" So there's something about being open to the universe, to both listen and walk through your fear, because on the other side of that trepidation could be something amazing. So that's one piece of advice. I would say the second piece for a lot of folks like us, Oliver, is use your privilege. Use it. It is an asset. It is a powerful asset. And our fellow citizens need us to use it. So that's the second piece. And I think the third piece of advice is be excellent. Be excellent at whatever it is you need to be excellent at. And I sort of think that excellence comes when your passion meets your purpose. Again, it's probably another way of just talking about mastery, but if you're excellent, it becomes a rising tide that lifts all boats.
Fantastic. I mean, I really appreciate the wisdom you've shared, Cheryl, today. And so many of the things are resonating with me. I love the idea of identifying where the power structures are and seeing people and the visibility that you talked about. And so many of the things that you shared with us, I think are really going to resonate with people. The last question, this new thing that I want to start doing is, we're in an era where not only are the information, powers that be conspiring to serve us things that concern us and worry us and frighten us, but that's kind of all we're dealing with. And certainly the last couple of years with COVID has not eased the psychological burden. I just wonder if you might share with our audience something that makes you optimistic or hopeful.
Something that makes me optimistic or hopeful. What a great question. And I love that that's a prompt that you're using. Well, it's sort of an easy question for me because I have the pleasure and privilege and honor of working with folks who every single day show up with fierceness, passion, commitment to make the world a better place. Oliver, you'll appreciate this given the work you do with Resolution Project. We just selected our next cohort of Echoing Green Fellows, and to have been in community with folks from Myanmar, from Libya, from Oman, from Northern California, from Dallas, who are just dazzling, who were committed to breaking through and fighting against these structural inequities. And they're so passionate and dedicated and inspirational. That gives me hope. You'd have to be dead inside if it didn't, but I'm just so grateful to those newest fellows in our community for showing up and inspiring me to keep going.
Well, I resonate a lot with that, as I'm sure you know. And so again, just an enormous thanks for spending some of your time and sharing your hard-won wisdom with our audience at the Owl Factor. I'm looking forward to our next episode. In the meantime, I hope everyone can join me in thanking Cheryl. Cheryl, I will tell you, the first time you and I were able to meet, I thought to myself, well, if I'm in the same room breathing the same air as Cheryl Dorsey, I must be doing something right. You are an inspiration to me. You've led incredibly effectively. You've been more than an excellent person, and I'm just deeply appreciative to you. So thank you, Cheryl, and see everybody very soon.